بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه مباركا عليه كما يحب ربنا ويرضى جل جلاله وعم نواله والصلاة والسلام على سيد الحبيب المصطفى صلى الله تعالى عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم تسليما كثيرا إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. Respected brothers and sisters, respected listeners, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm going to need a lot more interaction than that. Just to clarify to you from the beginning, this is not a speech, it's not a taqreer as you call it, it's not an inspirational talk. This is more of a dars, though I am standing up. It's supposed to be more of an interactive dars where we're trying to analyze our history to understand where this concept of taqleed or following qualified leadership came from and how it set into this ummah and how it's become so solidified. So I think what I'm going to need is a lot more interaction. Don't expect that information is going to be beamed into your heart or into the middle cortex of your brain as the TV does, where you just have to sit and give yourselves up to it. We're going to need a lot more interaction. You know, I want some response from you. Do you understand what I'm talking about? Because if not, then there's no point of doing this talk. This talk it's really geared towards us trying to understand, trying to refine our understanding, trying to get a better perspective of what our history is all about. And these inherited concepts and ideas and practices, where they come from and what are the purpose of these things. So just to begin, inshallah, if I can get that level of interaction with you, inshallah, if I can be promised that, then inshallah we can have a much better experience. You know, we want this experience to be profound. We don't want it to be something where you don't understand, and don't underestimate yourself. You know, for some of us who are just so used to listening to inspirational talks, when it comes to a dars, when it comes to a lesson that speaks about something at in more depth, when it's more analytical, we tend to switch off, because all we want to go back from here all spiritually elevated. Inshallah that will be the case, but inshallah it will also be educational, where hopefully we'll go back with solidified understanding, with more of a confirmation of the things that we may have been thinking about, and some doubt may have crept into it. Let's start from the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. During the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whether it came to matters of aqidah, theology, belief, or whether it came to matters of jurisprudence and practice, whether it was about what should I do if this happens in my prayer. You know, are these words, do they constitute a divorce and a talaq, for instance? It was very simple during that time. You went to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was not shut away. The Prophet ﷺ didn't have any guards outside his house. You could approach him outside the masjid or anywhere, and that was the simple character of the Prophet ﷺ. You could ask him the question. And thus many questions were posed to the Prophet ﷺ, and he responded in great detail. In the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there was no need for differences of opinion, because the legislator himself, the shari', the legislator himself was available to one and all, and for them to seek clarifications and seek their responses from. And thus, there was no need for any difference of opinion. If a difference of opinion did begin, then it was very short-lived, because it could be clarified by the Prophet ﷺ. On numerous occasions when such things did happen, the Prophet ﷺ either explained the better of the two opinions, or he even sometimes mentioned that both of those were valid opinions that were brought to him. We don't have the time to go into very specific examples of these things. Inshallah, Mufti Muhammad, when he comes later on in the next talk, he will be speaking about how various different ahadith, different traditions from the Prophet ﷺ were looked at and analyzed, and conclusions were derived in different ways by the different imams. He's talking about a very later stage of this development, and he'll talk about that in more detail. So I don't need to speak about that. What I'm trying to give a perspective of is the overview of how these things happened. Why did differences exist? Because the question today is, which I've had posed to me over and over again, is that why is there a difference? Why can't we all agree to one thing? Well, that's the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted it, and there's benefit and there's wisdom. There are certain benefits and wisdoms in the way things are today. Although I do think that for some of us have taken it way beyond what it's supposed to be and have actually violated some of the sanctity of this and some of the wisdoms of this. However, why is it not that everybody is together on one thing? Well, that was never supposed to be the case, and that is not what the Imams ever thought about either. When Imam Malik rahimahullah was told that we will make your Muwatta, one of the Khalifs said that we will make your Muwatta the standard book for jurisprudence, the standard book for Islamic law, and Islamic law and the legal system of Islam. We will make that the standard book throughout the Muslim lands. And he said no. He said no, because that was not the spirit of it. At the end of the day, whatever he was saying from his own personal endeavor was ijtihad. That was ijtihad. It was open to error. It was open to error, but whatever he was saying was done based on valid qualifications, and the conditions were met in terms of the exercise through which he reached the conclusions and the results that he did. So in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there was no need. There was no need for Ash'aris and Maturidis, Mu'tazila, etc., etc. Qul huwallahu ahad, Suratul Ikhlas was more than sufficient for the belief of the Sahaba. You know, you didn't have all of these intricate controversies and these peripheral issues of Aqeedah and theology. You didn't have the need for them, because Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yalid wa lam yulad, which was actually revealed according to one hadith based on the fact that some of the Quraysh, because they loved their ancestry and the lineage, and they came and said, Unsub lana rabbak, that give us the genealogy of your Lord. Give us the ancestry of your Lord, the family tree of your Lord. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals, Qul huwa Allahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yalid wa lam yulad, wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. So now what happens is that people used to come to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with certain questions. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would respond to them based on either their circumstance, based on the general ruling on a particular issue. So for example, somebody came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he said that, is it permissible for me to show some kind of light intimacy, like kissing with my wife in the month of Ramadan, while fasting? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said no to the person. For the other person, another person who came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam asking the same question, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, yes, it is permissible for you. Now, what happens is that the person who was told it was not permissible, he'll go and he'll practice upon it. He won't necessarily tell everybody. You know, if somebody asked him, he would probably inform them, and he would then relate it as a hadith on to the next generation, on to his students. The person who was told that it was permissible, again, he would practice on it according to what the Prophet ﷺ had told him. Now you have to remember, this is a very intimate thing. It's not done in public in Islam. You know, you don't see Muslim couples, well, hopefully not, you know, just kissing around each corners. Although now, unfortunately, you do see many just standing around, like talking furtively, and you know, you see that so many places outside universities, and it's like, you know, what's going on here? But inshallah, they're husband and wife. But the point is, the point to understand is that, you know, Muslims don't do this kind of stuff. So it was a very private affair. But however, what eventually happened is that, you know, one of the muhaddithin, he learned both from this source that it is permissible and the other source that it's not permissible. Now in that case, it was very easy to reconcile and tell and explain the reason why these things were differently said to each of the different individuals, the different Sahaba. The reason was, one was an older person, and he was a veteran in marriage. You know, light kissing wouldn't lead him to other things, and thus it was, you know, his fasting would be preserved, and thus it was permitted, because the act of kissing doesn't break the fast. Normal kissing I'm talking about. Whereas on the other hand, when you had the other person who was newly married, and for such a person, starting at that preliminary stage would obviously, or could very well and could most likely lead to the more advanced stages of intimacy, and thus it was not permitted for him. So now here, it was quite clear to a certain degree to understand why the Prophet ﷺ said one thing to one person and another thing to another person. Another very simple example, Mufti Muhammad should cover which Imam took which opinion and so on and so forth. Although in this case it was clearly that for a younger person it's not permissible, and for a veteran in marriage, somebody who's tried it all anyway for so many years, and for that person it's not permissible. However, there are other issues. For example, Ibn Umar radiallahu an. One of the greatest Sahaba, one of the younger ones, but one of the greatest Sahaba as well, son of Umar radiallahu an. He narrated that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that the deceased, the one who's died, he is punished due to the crying of his household on him or her. So if somebody passes away and the household cries over them, then that person will be punished based on that crying. And that was his perspective, that was his understanding of what he had heard and interpreted of the way the Prophet ﷺ had given a certain command. Whereas Aisha radiallahu anha, she said that this was regarding a particular Jewish woman who had passed away, and her family was wailing and crying over her, and the Prophet ﷺ's statement about her being punished was not that she was being punished because of her family crying, but the fact that what's the point of them crying over her death when she's being punished? There was just a correlation, it was not a causation. Whereas Ibn Umar radiallahu anh took it as a causation as opposed to a correlation or a coincidence. So you had difference of interpretation during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. One event that would take place, one of the Sahaba would think that, oh, this is the reason why the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said this. And another one would say, no, I know it's because of this reason. And obviously where this would differ is the level of intellectual acumen, level of ijtihad, level of faqaha, which is a deeper kind of insight into the way the Sharia works and the spirit of the Sharia. So for example, if Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu relates something, and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu relates something to the same effect, but his understanding is different from Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu's, most of the fuqaha, most of the jurists, the experts in this field, would probably take Abdullah ibn Mas'ud's narration radiallahu an, because his level of juristic insight, his level of faqaha was a lot greater than Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu was more of a very proficient narrator as opposed to as great a jurist as people like Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu an, Ibn Umar radiallahu an, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu an. So obviously, when Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anh would say something, his understanding would probably be based both on fiqh. He'd be interpreting the event based on his understanding of fiqh and jurisprudence and the other things that he had understood from the Prophet ﷺ. Whereas Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh, you could expect him to be relating it more in a veridical sense, in a more verbatim sense as such, more literal sense, as opposed to with as much insight as Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anh. Both had their positions. It's not to say that one is inferior. They're only inferior in sense of level of faqaha, because not all the Sahaba were the same in their level of insight into fiqh. They were not all muftis, right? Only some were the muftis, as we would call them, who had that level to be able to legislate. So what you have, for example, you have another situation where it mentions that a janazah passed by, a funeral procession passed by with them, picking up the bier, and the Prophet ﷺ stood up. Now, why did he stand up? Some were of the perspective and opinion that he stood up out of respect for that, out of respect for that funeral. Whereas the others, it said that this was actually a Jewish person's funeral that was going past by, and the Prophet ﷺ didn't want it to go over his head, and thus he stood up. So it was not out of reverence, but it was more out of not, wanting it to go over his head. But there was a difference of opinion in the way people interpreted this. Now this is natural. There's nothing wrong with this. This is human. This is the human condition. This is the way humans function, right? And only the prophets are directly revealed upon. Only the prophets get direct revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and wahi. Not everybody else. Everybody else is prone to error. Only the prophets, only the messengers alayhi salatu wasalam are those that are infallible and that don't commit error in this regard. And because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who's guiding them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who's revealing to them. In huwa illa wahyun yuha. It's a revelation that comes down from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and is revealed by Allah. Whereas everybody else could make a misunderstanding. When we look at events, each one of us may interpret it slightly differently. In fact, if you go back and you say what the speaker, if two of you go and explain what the speaker was saying, I guarantee you that your stories will be slightly variant, will be slightly different. They won't be entirely the same. In fact, if I tell you to just write about just a paragraph of what you think, or to describe this design, right? Or what the color of this door is, each of you will describe it differently. That's the human condition. We're all unique in our perspective, in our way, in our nature, and in our understanding, and even in our opinions. The point is that it needs to conform to the spirit of the Sharia, and that's what's important. So now you understand that from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there was the reason for differences of opinions to occur, because of the way the Sahaba may have interpreted something, or because of the Prophet ﷺ may have said something to one person, another thing to another person, based on either their circumstance, or based on that one was a general ruling and the other one was a specific ruling for that person. Now, it's up to the people who come later on to look at these and say, why exactly is there a difference of opinion here? Why did the Prophet ﷺ say one thing here and another thing here? And this is where something very important comes in. This call for studying of Bukhari, only. And, I've studied Bukhari, I've read the entire book, alhamdulillah, as most of the ulama have. It's not easy. Within one section, within one chapter, you will have one hadith that says one thing, another hadith that has an apparent contradiction, that says something else. Because the Prophet ﷺ said both of these things. And the Sahaba related it according to what they had heard. Now, how are you able to look into Bukhari and get your answers? Because you'd be more confused than anything else. That's why there was a need and a requirement, which the ulama completely perceived, like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, Qastallani, Aini, etc., etc. And they wrote these massive commentaries of 18 to 20 volumes that would just describe the ahadith, why Imam Bukhari brought a particular hadith here and not there, and why there is a difference of opinion, and exactly why the case was that this contradicts this. Obviously they're all superficial contradictions. You call them superficial contradictions that can be easily reconciled, but you need the knowledge. So you can't just look, if you're looking, for example, if you're looking for a ruling for a particular matter, you can't just look in one book. You can't just look at one hadith, the first hadith you see and say, great, that's what I'm going to act on. Because there could be 40 hadith on that particular issue, and it requires the mujtahid to look at this, the reader to look at all of this, and then to try to determine the common thread in all of these, to try to pick out exactly why the Prophet ﷺ said this or did this, and then to give a ruling based on that. It's not an easy issue. And I'll explain later, I'll try to go through some of the basic requirements for a mujtahid, for a person that can exercise this kind of independent judgment, or this exercise of, or this endeavor of trying to extract and infer a ruling. I'll try to go through some of these things afterwards. But right now, let's just keep to our history. So now you understand that in the ahadith, there is enough scope. And I'm saying this in a positive sense. There's enough scope for the differences of opinion that we see today. So it's not an alien thing, it's not a foreign thing, it's inherent within the system, but there's a benefit and there's a wisdom to it, which I'll come to later. Now, what happens is, during the time of the Sahaba, after the Prophet ﷺ departed from this world, many of the Sahaba, they moved out of Medina Munawwara. They went to Kufa and Basra and other cities around the Muslim world, and they began teaching. A number of students would flock to them to understand the matters of the deen, to listen to the ahadith from them, to listen to the rulings. Now some were narrating ahadith, others were also practitioners of this ahadith, in the sense that they were also inferring rulings. They were developing a legal system. Because as you know now, after the time of the Prophet ﷺ, Islam began to spread. It began to spread. It went into the Transox area. It went up to Azerbaijan, Armenia, and towards that area. It took over the entire Persian Empire, which is current day Iraq, Iran, and so on and so forth. It went up to Sham. Already these things had started during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, but it expanded. Now you had people from different cultures, different ideologies, different customs, and different ways of doing things. They wanted to know whether they could retain what they've been doing under Islam, or whether it was something alien to Islam and it had to be rejected. There were responses that had to be given to these people. You know, who's going to give him the responses? Because obviously with the Prophet ﷺ, although he said enough and the Quran gives us sufficient universal rulings that could be applied to any specific situation to give us a ruling, but there weren't specific rulings, you know, mentioned for every new issue that would occur. You know, it just couldn't be the case where the Prophet ﷺ would be able to. It didn't happen as such that the ahadith include everything in a specific way. For example, cloning. To take a simple example of recent times, right? Another example, if I give you another example, you know, can a man, you know, one of these bodybuilders that like to oil their body, right? And their chest and so on. And they've got a hairy chest and they want to shave the hair of their chest to look more feminine or for whatever reason, right? Can a man who wants to shave bodily hair, not the hair that's already mentioned that needs to be removed, but we're talking about hair from the arms, for example, hair on the chest, hair on the back. Can you remove that or not? Look in the Quran, you won't find any specific ruling about that. In fact, the Quran contains very few specific rulings. It contains many general maxims. It contains many general universal principles, all right, that are then expounded through some of the ahadith. Now, even if you look at the ahadith, I think you'd be very hard-pressed to actually come up with a direct ruling on can a man of today shave his chest after, you know, going to the gym or whatever it is. Where are you going to get this ruling from? Somebody's going to have to sit down and look at all of the other ahadith that are related to this. You know, all of the sources of the Sharia through the ijma' and other sources, to look at something similar, if something similar has been legislated upon, and then to try to determine a ruling for this particular thing. Now, obviously, every jurist that would sit and try to perform this endeavor to come up with the ruling for, you know, the removal of hair from the chest, if I want to take that example, they may come up with different ideas. Some will say, no, it's not permissible. Some will say, it will be permissible. Some may say, it's only permissible under this circumstance and not under that circumstance. You know, there's a very rich variation that you'll get. Yeah, if the brothers can move forward to make some room, inshallah, for the brothers who are coming in. Jazakallah khairan. Okay, another very simple example. I'll give you another very simple example. When it came to the time of the Imams, what happened is, like, during the time of the Sahaba, on one Jumu'ah, during one Jumu'ah prayer, a Sahabi came in. And the khutbah had already begun. The Prophet ﷺ had already begun to deliver his khutbah and his sermon. And when this Sahabi came in, the Prophet ﷺ said, stand up and pray. Make your, you know, your sunnah, nafil prayers, whatever it was, you know, there's difference of opinion whether it's a sunnah he's talking about, whether it's a tahiyatul masjid or whatever it is. Stand up and pray. So he stood up and he prayed. Now, some of the imams, they look at this and say, the reason why he stood and prayed is because he was a poor person. And the Prophet ﷺ, after that prayer, actually encouraged people to spend on him, to contribute, to donate to him. Because he was a very poor person, very disabled state. His clothing were not. Sulayk al-Ghatafani, his name was. Sulayk al-Ghatafani, right? That was his name. Because there are other ahadith which, when you look at, they will tell you that the Prophet ﷺ encouraged people to spend. In fact, one version, one narration of this hadith also mentions that when the Prophet ﷺ told the person to pray, the Prophet ﷺ himself stopped his khutbah, right? He paused it until he finished. Now, from all of this, we understand that there was a reason why he told him to pray. Because not in any other time do we find that the Prophet ﷺ told people to pray while in the sermon. Because the whole idea of a sermon is that you listen. Why would the Prophet ﷺ be speaking if he's telling people to pray at the same time? It's like telling people to ignore him. Because in salat, you need concentration. Not everybody can do two things at once. And you're supposed to be talking to Allah and your intimate discourses with Allah in your salat. So obviously it doesn't sound right. But here he told this person for a particular reason. So some imams have said that there is no sunnah prayer because the hadith is clear. إِذَا خَرَجَ الْإِمَامِ فَلَا صَلَاةَ وَلَا كَلَامٍ. As soon as the imam appears and emerges, then there's no salat you can do, and neither is there any discourse or any speaking after that. right? And that would supersede all of these other situations where we would look at these other situations and say it was for a particular purpose. But there are some imams and some jurists who've looked at this and said, no, what the Prophet ﷺ is saying here is that these 2 rakats are so important that even when the khutbah is on, you can stand up and quickly do those 2 rakats. And that's why for the Shafi'is, for instance, if a person comes very late for khutbah, and the khutbah is about to end, and he doesn't reckon that he will be able to make his 2 rak'ats before the imam finishes the khutbah and begin the prayer, then he should actually just stand and wait. And this was actually very irritating to me in the beginning, because while I was an imam in America, you had, mashallah, cosmopolitan of people in terms of different manahij, different madhabs, and so on and so forth. And there'd be a few individuals that'd come late, which was irritating enough, and then they would stand at the back, and I'm like, what's wrong with you? I didn't say anything to them, but then eventually when I looked into the Shafi'i school, and it seems they hail from the Shafi'i school, the idea is that if you come too late and you don't have enough time for Tahiyatul Masjid, then you stay standing until the imam finishes, because it's going to finish in a few seconds, a minute or so, and then you join the prayer standing up of the Jumu'ah prayer. Because the hukum, even in the Hanafi school, is that if you come in and you join a fard prayer, right, and you had an intention to make Tahiyatul Masjid, and according to some, even if you didn't, then your Tahiyatul Masjid is incorporated, because Tahiyatul Masjid means greeting the Masjid. You're making a fard prayer, you're greeting the Masjid anyway, right? So it's kind of very interesting the way people looked, the jurists looked at different, the similar situation, but in different ways. And that's what they were told to do. So we can't say you are wrong in what you did. And we can't say to the other imam that you are wrong in what you did. But what we can say is that this one is correct according to Allah. Or in my opinion is correct according to Allah. Because we don't really know what is correct according to Allah. Because Allah doesn't reveal this book and say yes and He puts a tick mark, or He doesn't do that. I'll get into that a bit later. I'll expound on that a bit more later. You see, I was only given an hour. That's why we have Asr prayer. So I'm trying to cover a lot of ground. So it may seem a bit like a roller coaster ride if you're used to those, right? So hopefully it's not passing over your head. Hopefully inshallah, you're understanding something. Are you guys understanding something? Inshallah. Okay. Now what happens is there's a need to look at the corpus of hadith, the sunnah, the actions of the people of Medina, the actions of the Sahaba, and exactly what the Sahaba also narrated to others, and then obviously the Quran is the primary source. The time of Umar radiallahu anh, he, on many issues that were very prominently disagreed upon, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu did not have the time. He didn't have the time to deal with these issues, because in his 2 years and certain number of months khilafah that he had, his entire focus went into quelling the rebellion, and all of these apostates and others who challenged certain aspects of Islam and so on and so forth. So his entire 2 years and a half or so went into that. Umar radiallahu anhu, he inherited a very calm kind of system, and then after that he focused on a number of other things, both the expansion of Islam into other areas, and also at home to look at the prominent issues that were of differences of opinion among the Sahaba. What he did is he kind of would form a little committee, and he would determine among them, what exactly the Prophet ﷺ had said. If it was a matter that related to women, for example, he would have Aisha radiallahu anha consulted about that, because Aisha radiallahu anha was a faqihah, she was a jurist in her own right. She was very close to Prophet ﷺ, also a very prolific narrator of ahadith, and thus they managed to reach a consensus. Much ijma', some would argue that a lot of the ijma' was reached. The consensus was reached at his time. Now obviously then Uthman radiallahu anhu's time comes, and eventually there's a lot of chaos eventually during that time. But what's happening now around the Muslim Ummah is that there are different ulama in Medina, in Kufa, in Basra, in Mecca, Mukarramah, and other places that are teaching and that are legislating, and people are following them. So for example, what you had, just to give you a few names, because I think we need to mention these names so that, they become familiar to us. They are our heritage, right? So what you had, for example, is that among the Sahaba, who are the great fuqaha, who are the great jurists, the muftis among the Sahaba, right? Obviously the 4 khulafa. Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali radiallahu anhum. You had Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. I mean, you would put him at a very high position. Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, another one. Another one was Mu'adh ibn Jabal radiallahu anhu. Ubay ibn Ka'ab. And then you had Zayd ibn Thabit. I mean, these are some of the names that really stand out as being jurists among the ulama, among the Sahaba. And then let's look at the different cities. So let's look at Medina Munawwara, for example. In Medina Munawwara, you had a number of jurists. Now, I'm sure there were other jurists, but these are the ones that became famous because people began to go to them and learn from them. You know, like for example, take London. You've got a number of different masjids, you've got a number of different ulama teaching. Let's just take doctors, for example. You've got a number of different doctors. Normally, you'll just go to your local doctor, your local GP. But when it comes to a special matter which is beyond him and needs a special training, then he'll send you to the London hospital or some other hospital for the specific eye, nose and throat, or or for cardiology or for pathology or any of the other specializations, because he doesn't know it. Likewise, you'd go to an alim, you'd learn from them, and if they couldn't, they'd send you to somebody else. Eventually, a few people would become more famous than others because everybody is resorting to them, everybody is going to them. I mean, it's just a natural selection process. That's the natural evolution that takes place, in that positive way, in that sense, right? So when you go to Medina, you had Aisha radiallahu anha, and she lived for a number of years after the Prophet ﷺ had departed. So Aisha radiallahu anha, Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, right? Now these are the tabi'een. Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, Urwa ibn al-Zubayr, ibn al-Awam, right? Ali ibn Hussein, Salim ibn Abdullah ibn Umar, Abdullah ibn Umar's son, Sulaiman ibn Yasar, Qasim ibn Muhammad ibn Abi Zakaria, Nafi' ibn Shihab al-Zuhri. I'm sure some of you must have heard these names before, right? You had Abu Zanad, Abdullah ibn Dhakwan, Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari, and you had Rabi'at ibn Abdur-Rahman or Rabi'at al-Rai, right? So you had these famous scholars who became famous more than anybody else. Now obviously even among them, there would be some that would be even more famous. So for example, it's even related among the Sahaba that somebody came to one of them to ask a question, and he said, I don't know the answer to this. Go to so-and-so Sahabi, Abdullah ibn Abbas or somebody else, and ask him, whatever he tells you, come and tell me as well. It's just a natural thing. That's the way it happens, right? Because not everybody has the same level of knowledge. And if you're humble enough and you're a true scholar, you will consult others. Your learning never ends in Islam. Now when you go to Makkah Mukarramah, you had Ata ibn Abi Rabah. That's a great scholar of Makkah Mukarramah. You had Ikrimah. You had Mujahid ibn Jubair. And of course you had Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu. Remember Ibn Abbas, Abdullah ibn Umar, these two were very young when the Prophet ﷺ passed away. But they had really absorbed a lot from the Prophet ﷺ. That's why they were able to really spread their knowledge afterwards, because they stayed for a lot longer. They come to Kufa. Now Kufa had a great number of people. You had, for example, Alqamah ibn Qais al-Nakhai. You had Masruq ibn al-Ajda', right? You had Ubaydah ibn Umar al-Salmani. You had Aswad ibn Yazid al-Nakhai. You had Shurayh ibn Harith al-Makki, or al-Kindi rather. Shurayh al-Qadi is the famous Qadi that you hear about in the various stories that are related from that time. Ibrahim ibn Yazid al-Nakhai, and you had Sa'id ibn Jubair. You go to Basra. In Basra you had Anas ibn Malik radiyallahu anhu. You had Abu al-Aliya, Abu al-Sha'tha, Muhammad ibn Sirin, the great interpreter of dreams as well. In those times, the ulama were masters of more than one discipline. Both in terms of, when you look at Muhammad ibn Sirin, you'll find his aqwal. Hassan Basri, you'll find his opinions both in tafsir books. You'll find it for hadith. You'll find it for spirituality. You'll find it in fiqh. You'll find them in the various different disciplines. You'll find their names, because these were the barakah of their time allowed them to become a master and become proficient in all of these subjects, which is extremely difficult nowadays. Even to become a master in a single discipline, it is extremely difficult. Obviously, people began to go to these people. Slowly, they taught others, and they taught their students. So obviously, Abdullah, Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, Imam Shafi, Imam Muhammad, and Imam Malik, they were the students of the likes of these people that I just mentioned. And eventually what happened is that because these people had actually seen a walking, talking Islam, the entire culture of Islam still alive, there were more of these people who could actually understand the true spirit of the deen. But obviously, as with every subsequent generation, the light of prophethood is dimming, and there is less proficiency. And thus, you had eventually what you had is you had a lot less people who are as proficient as these masters. But eventually what happened is that there were 4 people, after the 3rd and 4th century, there were 4 people that literally everybody agreed upon that these are the 4 traditions that we will take from. Because these traditions, they proliferated. They spread far and wide. Maybe, and this was Abu Hanifa's tradition, this was Shafi'i, Malik, and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal's traditions. Right? They spread far and wide. Why? Because they codified a system. They collected the rulings together and presented it in a codified way. They had enough students. It was a natural selection by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was by design, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, bringing people closer to them. Right? To these people more than others. Because if you look at it, though we only know 4 madhabs as such, although there's a 5th madhab today, and I'm sure there's a 6th and 7th one as well today, right? Contemporary madhab, modernists and progressives and so on and so forth. But in terms of traditional madhab, we see 4 that have actually stood the test of time, right? Have a historicity attached to it. There were others, but they didn't live. They lived maybe some didn't even live for a century. Some lived for the 1st generation, and then there weren't enough students to continue it. Because let's just say that I've got all of these bright ideas, and I teach about 20 people, and they are very enlightened. Now these 20 people, they become very enlightened by that, but they don't feel it's good enough to pass on to anybody else, and they go and they start doing something else. Whatever I've taught is going to disappear. Do you know what I'm saying? Whatever I've taught is going to disappear. So now, I was told that the adhan wasn't going to be played, so that's why I carried on. But anyway, it's like, let's just say somebody writes something great and puts a book out. But that book sells for the 1,000 print run, and then after that it's never printed again. Right? It's remained and it's gone. That's it. That heritage is finished. But at the end of the day, it's the acceptance by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The acceptance that comes from Allah, the qubuliyah, that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for these madhahib, right? That it was only these 4 that continued and that stood the test of time and were actually developed further and have come as they are. Because if you look, you had a school of Sufyan al-Thawri, Sufyan ibn Sa'id al-Thawri. Right? Sharik ibn Abdullah al-Nakhai. Nakhai had a school. He was teaching people. Right? You had Abu Sulaiman Dawood al-Zahiri. In fact, his school actually lasted a while longer until that eventually died out as well. That was a literalist school where they would look at everything in a very veridical, very verbatim way. Right? Like for example, one opinion that's mentioned from them is the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ says that La tabulu, do not urinate in still water. Do not urinate in still water. Now obviously, still water, the reason you don't urinate in there is because it pollutes it and others can't use it then, because it's still water and the impurity won't flow away. So it doesn't have a sense of self-purification, all right? What some of the Zahiris said is that because the Prophet ﷺ said you can't urinate in there, it's prohibited. But you can defecate in there because he didn't say you can't defecate. So you can see the literalism that went into their perspective. And obviously that couldn't remain because it was too black and white. It didn't have any color to it, right? And the problem is that there is a neo-Zahirism today, which is that people are trying to return to Zahirism, to a literal kind of outlook, right? And trying to just basically disqualify all of the heritage that we have from before. So anyway, you had Dawud al-Zahiri, you had Abu Abdur-Rahman ibn Muhammad al-Awza'i, very famous. Awza'i was very famous, and his discussions with some of the students of Imam Abu Hanifa as well. Then there was Muhammad ibn Abdur-Rahman ibn Abi Layla. Now there were others as well, but these are some of the prominent ones who had schools, but they weren't very enduring. They didn't last for too long. The students maybe didn't have enough students or enough proficient students or enough famous students. Now, why did the other madhabs become so proliferated? Like if you look at it today, probably half of the madhab following world is Hanafi, right? Because if you look at just China alone, the 40 million, or according to some research, 100 million Muslims there are all Hanafi, right? You look at, massive in India, Pakistan, for the majority of, except the southern area is Shafi'i, right? Sri Lanka is Shafi'i as well, right? Syria, you look at the whole Bosnia, you look at a number of the USSR, the previous pre-USSR states, and so on and so forth, right? Iran and other places. The second most prolific is the Malikis, not the Shafi'is, right? It's actually the Maliki. The whole of North Africa is supposed to be Maliki, except that unfortunately there are people that have basically moved on to some other ideologies recently in places like Algeria and others, right? Then you've got the Shafi'is, and then you've got the Hanbalis. The Hanbalis are a very small group today, right? The Hanbalis are a very small group today. The focus of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal and his proficiency was more in hadith, according to many of the scholars. And that's what he wrote more on in terms of fiqh. That's why they say that his madhab as such wasn't as strong in terms of its endurance. A great madhab. I mean, Imam Ahmad, you can't, you just can't put anybody, equal with him in terms of his proficiency and his zuhd and everything. I mean, he's an imam. I mean, if you can have a few imams among our history, he's one of the imams, not just in fiqh, but in hadith and in everything else. But when we're looking at it purely from a juridical point of view, then that's what we get. Eventually, it just became normal and the practice that everybody who learnt fiqh, learnt it under one of the schools, right? Until about 200 years ago, about 150 years ago. When when it slowly began that we don't need the four madhabs. I don't entertain conspiracy theories. I'm not saying it's a British thing, as some people like to say, right? Wallahu a'lam what the reason was for that. But the fact is there, that it's only about 150 to 200 years old. Because, I'll tell you something, let's take a survey, right? This is something I want you to do. Just give me the names of 5 scholars, quickly, right? Volunteer some names of prominent scholars who most of us will know about. We've heard their name, right? That are beyond 200 years. Throw me some names. Sorry? Ibn Taymiyyah. Okay, alhamdulillah. That's one. Another one? Imam Suyuti. Right? So I'll write him down. Ibn Taymiyyah, Suyuti. Who else? Ghazali. Okay, carry on. Bin Baz is recent. Rahimahullah. Sorry? See, that's the problem. Some people they don't even know beyond 200 years. No offense to whoever said it, but I'm saying over 200 years. Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd and Ibn Hajar. You want one more for Barakah? Ibn Hajar, who? Imam Nawawi, you can't miss him, right? MashaAllah, we've got a lot of Shafi'is here. Anyway, let's look at these, right? Ibn Taymiyyah, the first one, Rahimahullah, Shaykhul Islam. He was a Hanbali. Right? He never said, don't become a Hanbali. He was a Hanbali. In fact, my current professor, Abdul Hakim al-Matrudi, he speaks about the influence of Ibn Taymiyyah and the Hanbali school. His entire thesis was on that subject, of whether, what affected what. His whole discussion is about that. Yes, there's no doubt that many of these scholars that you've mentioned had opinions that went against their madhab, because they had the level of ijtihad. They had the level of this proficiency in qualification to infer their own rulings. And they did go against in some issues from their madhab. But they were still, you could call them either affiliated mujtahids, right? Or mujtahids within the madhab. But they were primarily Hanbali. In fact, if you look at Ibn Taymiyyah, his father and grandfather were all great scholars of the Hanbali school. Right? And they've written text on that subject. So Ibn Taymiyyah was a Hanbali, there's no doubt about that. Yes, he had divergent opinions and he had tafarrudat, and he has the absolute right for that. Just like Tahawi has for the Hanafi school as well. But as a Hanafi, I can't follow Tahawi's opinion, because he doesn't represent the school in his isolated opinion, in his personal opinion. I have to follow the school, right? Number one, Suyuti. Suyuti is no doubt, he's a Shafi'i scholar, right? Well within the Shafi'i school. Ghazali, primarily Shafi'i. Although he did have opinions. If you look at his Bidayatul Hidayah, if you look at his Ihya, if you look at some of the other books of fiqh, he is kind of ambiguous in some of his fiqh in terms of the ruling. For example, I mean, he's with the Hanafis when it comes to raising the hands up to the ears, right? But in some of his books he mentions up to the shoulders, right? But he was a Shafi'i, there's no doubt, because he wrote in the usul of the Shafi'i school. So he was a legalist of the Shafi'i school as well, usuli. Ibn Rushd was a Maliki for the most part. Though, he was a philosopher when it came to, he was a very Aristotelian ideology, a refiner of the Aristotelian ideology. But he was definitely a Maliki. Okay. And then Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, you can't get a bigger Shafi'i than him. Right? Alhamdulillah. And Nawawi, again, another massive Shafi'i scholar. Right, of colossal terms, absolutely, right, all of these. So you'd be hard pressed to find a single scholar from before 200 years ago that didn't affiliate themselves to the madhab unless they were a Zahiri. Unless they were Zahiri. Yeah. Imam Shawkani is recent. He's from Yemen. Imam Shawkani is recent. Imam Shawkani started off with something maybe from the Zaydi background, right, which is Zaydi Hanafi maybe, I'm not really sure. And then after that, I think he was a mujtahid in his own right or something. I'm not sure, right? But he's recent. So you can't permit, you can't, there was something accepted upon. In fact, you had one of the Hanbali scholars, I think it's either Ibn Qudam, Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, one of the two. They wrote, الرد على من لم يتبع المذاهب الأربعة. That a repudiation of those who don't follow one of the four madhabs. Right? I'm going to have to stop here because it is salat time. There's a lot more to be said, but hopefully you've got an understanding of how these things developed. And finally, for a mujtahid, it's not in, I just want to say this one last point because I find that it's so important. If somebody has the entire corpus of ahadith, which were maybe not even available to all the imams, for example, right? He's got all the hadith, he's got a best database, he's got a very, very good computer system, and all the rest of it, right? And he's got the ability to, to correlate and to, show the correspondence and everything. Do you think that he can provide a good madhab? If he was given all the resource and everything, the reason he won't be able to is because there's no living tradition today that will show you how these rules were manifested and were practiced. What the four imams had is they still had communities around the world, wherever they were, they still had Sahaba, Tabi'een and others who still showed what it was like to be in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Today you can't point out one single area where it's exactly like that, where you can be reading your hadith and look there and think, oh, and now I understand what that is. I'm telling you, when we're studying even lugha, when we're studying lexicography, when we're studying even fiqh and hadith, you don't understand what you're reading until you actually go somewhere in the world and you actually see, oh, now I understand what that was talking about. It is not a simple endeavor, I'm telling you. That's why madhab, for a mujtahid mutlaq, an independent mujtahid to come about the likes of that, though someone might be intelligent enough, there's just not maybe enough other things. There's no, obviously the tawfiq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's a whole different thing. It's not enough for us to get that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the tawfiq wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. The reason I just wanted to continue this for a few more moments. If we can get the sisters to also settle down, inshallah, just for the next 10-15 minutes. Jazakallah khairan. I think that it was actually very important for us to come back and for me to actually round this off, finish it up, because what we covered so far was purely from a very historical level, and I think we need to really tie in and understand the whole concept of unity of the ummah with it, and I think that's extremely important. There are also some very frequently asked questions with regards to this issue, common misconceptions, common confusions and misunderstandings, which I'm sure will come up in the question and answers, and I want to preempt them by trying to cover some of them right now. Right? These are certain questions that bother many of us and will basically taint our perspective as such and our understanding of what has been said so far. So I think they need to be clarified. I just want to mention one or two things. Why did, for example, the Hanafi school proliferate so greatly? 50% of the ummah maybe, right? I mean, these are, this is not any kind of personal statistics that I've conducted, but this is according to what some of the ulama have mentioned, just a basic survey of the Muslim lands. One of the reasons just could be that people like Imam Abu Yusuf, right, was made the Qadi al-Qudat, the supreme judge, the judge of all judges under Harun al-Rashid, one of the greatest caliphs of the Abbasid Caliphate, right? And obviously that must have had some influence because he wrote his Kitab al-Kharaj and some other books for Harun al-Rashid. Then you had, for example, the Uthmanis, the Uthmani Turks. It was probably one of the longest ruling dynasties ever to have lived and ever to have come and gone. About 600 or 700 years. And they were primarily Hanafi as well. Not that they ever enforced it. It wasn't like that's the only thing that could function under their rule. But obviously when you've got the supreme authority doing something in a particular way, people normally follow suit. That's why the constitutions of Egypt today was based on the Hanafi school. Obviously it's been modernized, and there's a number of other issues that have crept in there, from the new Azhar as such. So there are a number of reasons. Obviously there are a number of reasons if you want to go into it, from a geopolitical perspective. But anyway, that's not what we want to do today. What I'm looking at is that's the fact of the matter, and that's what happened. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted in a particular way. Some provide this as a wisdom, that one of the reasons why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had 4 madhabs as such proliferate is so that everything that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam ever did, right? Because there were some things that he did earlier on and then they stopped doing it. Right? For example, there's a hadith which talks about raising the hands in the prayer at every single movement. Before sajda, after the sajda, between the two sajdas. You can find these hadith in Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar of Tahawi. Right? And then you have some ahadith which speak about just doing it at the beginning and before and after ruku. And then you have some ahadith like Abdullah ibn Mas'ud relates that he only did it in the beginning and never did it again. So now what happened? Some have shown a chronology of events of saying that initially it was before it was a part of every single movement, and then it was reduced when finally there was more sukoon in the prayer, because initially you could even speak in prayer. If you came in, you could ask the guy what rakat is the imam on, right? You could move in the prayer before, but all of these things became a lot more tight as the people became more used to it, right? And these things became abrogated, mansukh. Now for the Shafi'is, they took it at the middle, where they said, okay, before ruku and after ruku we're going to do that. Likewise the Hanbalis. Whereas the Hanafis said no, Hanafis and Malikis said no, we're going to take the hadith of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, where we're going to take the first one. But anyway, just a few of the other issues I'd like to just preempt, as I mentioned. The whole call today that you don't need to follow a madhab, right? There are 2 groups primarily. There's a variation between, but there are 2 types of calls towards no madhab, right? One say that let's disown everything in between, go back to the Quran and Sunnah and take it literally, right? That's one approach. The second approach is they're better with the madhabs. They said we can benefit from all of them, but we need to reinterpret the entire Sharia according to contemporary times. So we need a reinterpretation. We need a modernization of faith. Right? Now you can see the problem with both of these, because one is completely rejecting, this many centuries of scholarship. And the other ones again are rejecting it indirectly by saying we need to reinterpret, thinking that it's not applicable. No doubt there are certain issues that can be further developed. There's no doubt about that. But if you go back to the first approach, many people who call to that first approach, that disregard everything, don't go with the Hanafi, Shafi, Maliki and Hanbali, what's this all about? And look at the Quran and Sunnah yourself. Now let's just say that I say, okay, fine, away with all of these madhabs. Let me go directly to the Quran and Sunnah. And I'm looking for a particular issue. And I look at Bukhari and Muslim and so on and so forth, and I come up with my own opinion based on what I read. But it goes against what, for example, Fadilat al-Shaykh Abdul Aziz bin Baz said, or what Shaykh al-Albani said, or for example what Shaykh al-Uthaymeen said, or anybody else, for instance, rahimahumullah. Right? If I come up with my own ijtihad and my own Quran and Sunnah understanding, and I come up with an opinion, they're still going to reject what I'm saying. Basically the call is towards the 5th madhab. It's not the fact that reject the 4 and do it yourself, because nobody can do it themselves except the mujtahid. And we'll talk about a mujtahid later. It's a call towards the 5th madhab. It's a call towards the 5th madhab. And it's a contemporary madhab. But the question is, why should I give away my Rolls Royce for I don't want to say a Mini Cooper because they're quite nice, right? But you know what I'm saying. Something that was a lot closer to the time of the Sahaba, tried and tested, 1400 years of experience. And I want to leave that to follow something that's in its first generation? That's in his first generation. That you have to understand that. That's the crux of the matter here. The idea is not that everybody individualize their faith by doing their own ijtihad. Nobody agrees with that. Because you'd have, and as we do have in certain places, we have about 50 different perspectives. Number two, they say that madhahib, this is a part of the heresy of the ummah. Right? This is not the firqatun najiyah. As the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, Abu Dawud and others, it mentions about this firqah that there will only be one sect that will be the saved sect, and all of the other 73 will go to hell. That is obviously talking about aqeedah. That is not the ikhtilaf in the furu'. It's not the ikhtilaf in the branches of faith like the jurisprudence. That is clearly in aqeedah when you're talking about the Hanafis, Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. You're talking about the Mu'tazila, the various group under the Mu'tazila. I mean, people like Shahrastani and Abdul Qahir al-Baghdadi and many of these others. They've already, in their time, according to their understanding, they've already enumerated these 73 sects. But obviously that's an ongoing thing. Nobody can decide exactly who these sects were, because what level the Prophet ﷺ talked about this at, what intensity of the sect and so on. But basically there's clearly the different sects of the Shia, the different sects of the Khawarij, the Mu'tazila, the Murji'ah, the Qadariyah, the Jabariyah, and so on and so forth. It's talking about a difference of opinion on a polemical aqeedah, theological level. Right? It's not talking about the furu', because the four imams did not differ in terms of the fundamental aspects of aqeedah. They all agreed upon. They will never condemn each other for that reason. Okay, that's another one. The other thing is that there is an adab between the madhahib. When do you see a Shafi like just bashing a Maliki and putting him down? In fact, the great ulama of each of the school never allowed that to happen. Yes, as an academic discourse they allowed it. For example, in front of one of the great scholars of India, Rashid, I think it was, I forget, maybe it was Maulana Rashid Ahmed Gangohi or somebody else. He must have really explained the matter and really broken down the daleels of the Shafi'i school, right, on a particular issue. One of his students got up, in this great sense of emotion after hearing his teacher's breakdown, academic breakdown of the point of view in the Shafi'i school, and he said, if Imam Shafi'i was here today, he would have even listened to you. You get a few people like that, who say that when Masih Isa alayhi salatu wasalam will come, he will be Hanafi. You got a few people like that who claim that, who like absolutely are convinced that that's going to be the fact, right? But that's not the way to do this. That's not the way to do this. What did the Shaykh say? Despite the fact that, he was breaking down the opinion of the Shafi'i school, when he heard his students say, he said that, he really put the guy down. He said, don't you understand that if Imam Shafi'i was even here, you think I would have even spoken? Do you think I would have even spoken? Right? So that's the adab they had for each of their ijtihad, because the whole adab was رَأْيِي صَحِيح يَحْتَمِلُ الْخَطَأ وَرَأْيُكَ خَطَأ يَحْتَمِلُ الصَّوَابِ. Because it's a matter of, we don't know what the clear-cut truth is according to Allah, because you can't go and ask Allah. What we're told though, according to the hadith, Bukhari, Muslim and other narrators, when a mujtahid does his ijtihad, what does ijtihad mean? Ijtihad is a qualified person who has access to the sources, who has all of the prerequisite knowledge and information, and all of the ulum and the sciences, and then he looks at the Quran and Sunnah to derive a ruling that is not already legislated upon. That's what a mujtahid is supposed to do, to exercise this endeavor. So what the hadith says is that when a mujtahid does that, and he is able to reach the truth, that is the truth according to Allah, he won't know, but he will think it's the truth, obviously. Because you don't know what exactly Allah has according, what is the truth according to Allah, right? But we have to assume we know, right? When he reaches that truth, and if it corresponds with the truth according to Allah, he will get 2 rewards. And if it doesn't, then because he did what he was told to do in the Sharia, he will get 1 reward, even if he's absolutely wrong. For example, let's just say there's a very difficult divorce issue, where the husband said certain things and whatever, the wife is saying no. One mufti says it's a divorce, another one said it's not a divorce. Obviously it can only be one thing. You can't have a couple that are married and not married. There's no hal in between the two. There's no intermediate, position in between the two. There has to be one of them is right. But each mufti is insisting, right, based on his ijtihad. They're both valid ijtihads, but which one is more correct? Only one is more correct according to Allah. According to the usulis, only one is correct according to Allah. right? We won't know that, but we have to assume that whatever we're following is more correct. So as a Shafi'i, I have to think that whatever I'm following is more correct, but it has the possibility of being wrong. And what you're following as a Hanafi or a Maliki is wrong, but has the possibility of being correct. And there's ulama like Anwar Shah Kashmiri and others, rahimahullah, they've even discussed whether Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reveal on the Day of Judgment who was more correct on any given issue. And he said, I don't think so, because every mujtahid did what they were supposed to do, which was to make the ijtihad, and people followed them. If you don't have, if you were born in a Hanafi school, in a Hanafi household, you don't have to stick to the Hanafi school. You can become a Shafi'i. If you were born in a Shafi'i background, you don't have to stick to that. You can become a Hanafi, but you don't change every week. You change once. You change according to what's accessible to you, right? The background on this is what is accessible. Have you got books? Have you got ulama that you can access? I remember once I went to a program, a retreat, and one brother I know is absolutely he's from Hyderabad or from Pakistan, right? Typical Hanafi brother, and he's doing Raf' al-Yadayn. And he's traditional. I mean, I knew that he follows a madhab, right? But he's doing Raf' al-Yadayn. I'm like, what are you doing? He said, I'm a Maliki now, right? He's from Philadelphia. And I said, but why are you raising your hands for? He says, well, for him, poor guy, he wants to become a Maliki because he's studying under Sheikh Khalid Blankenship, right? Dr. Khalid Blankenship, I think, or whatever. But he hasn't studied the Salat enough to understand that the Malikis also don't raise their hands. He thinks just doing what my dad doesn't do is Maliki. You know what I'm saying? Just something different. I want to be different. Wallahu a'lam. Right? Obviously it looked really stupid, didn't it? But what I'm trying to say is that that's not the point. The point is that you go and you take a madhab that you have access to. Because it's all about following the deen, following the Quran, Sunnah, following the Prophet ﷺ through someone who's already done the work for you, because we just can't do it ourselves. Because we don't have the requisites of, or the qualifications of ijtihad and so on. Okay, so that's the adab. There needs to be an adab. And yes, there may be a few instances in our history where people have fought, right? A few zealots got up and they began to fight with each other. But for the most part, and even today, if I see a Maliki brother, I'm more than happy to see him. And I learn from him. I just love it, because I go, what do you guys say about this? What do you guys say about this? It really improves your understanding of the legal system of Islam. Okay, another one is, one thing you have to remember is that the Hanafi madhab, as opposed to the Shafi'i, Maliki and Hanbali madhab, was not a single man endeavor. And neither was it just 3 muftis either. It was an entire group of 40 experts in the various different fields, including, people from all the way from spirituality to lugha, to lexicography, to hadith and everybody else. Imam Muhammad al-Shaybani, Zakaria ibn Abi Zaida, and, all to the likes of Fudail ibn Iyad and Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak. So it was a group effort. In fact, it says that for 3 months sometimes they would debate on an issue. And they couldn't reach a conclusion. And finally, after 3 months, it would be written, Qala Abu Hanifa this, and Qala Abu Yusuf and Muhammad this. And that's how it go down. That's how we've inherited it. Now the flexibility that gives the muftis of today, that they can actually pick and choose within their own madhab, according to certain parameters, obviously. But it gives a great flexibility. Another thing was, Imam Abu Hanifa was a tabi'i. Right? I don't want to talk about I don't want to talk about why I'm a Hanafi or whatever, but these are just certain points, okay? I'm not saying the Hanafis are better than the Shafis or whatever, all right? Although I do believe that as a Hanafi, I have to think that whatever we're doing is the best opinion, okay? Is the most valid opinion. Another thing that comes up that's been going around is that the Imam said, and it's quoted from them, that, if you see a hadith that's sahih, then reject my qawl, reject my opinion, and take what's sahih. Then how do you deal with that issue? Well, the thing is that you have to remember, these imams were not idiots. They weren't talking to Tom, Dick and Harry. They were talking to muhaddithin. They were talking to their students. How many minutes? Okay. They were talking to their students who were muhaddithin, that obviously if there's some other hadith that you come across, you can reject what I'm saying because our understanding was based on this. He wasn't talking to just anybody off the street who finds a hadith somewhere and says, oh, Imam Abu Hanifa didn't see this. How do you know he didn't see that? Do you know? So it's very difficult for you to determine that he didn't see something. You can maybe establish what he did see, but you can't establish what he did not see and say that because he didn't see that, because that process of elimination is just impossible to do, right? We're not privy to his life at that time. Or for any other imam for that matter. So you have to remember, this statement is to the muhaddithin. And number three, when he talks about weak ahadith, you have to remember that a hadith that's weak today was not necessarily weak when the imams had it. Because if you look at it, Imam Abu Hanifa passed away in 150 Hijri. Imam Malik passed away in 179. Imam Shafi in 204 and Imam Ahmad in 241. Imam Bukhari passed away after that in 256. He was only born in 194. So when Imam Bukhari got the hadith, there may have been now a narrator who came in after Imam Abu Hanifa's time, who was a weak narrator, and the hadith happened to only be narrated from him. Now Imam Bukhari couldn't take that hadith anymore. Whereas earlier on, before that time, it was sahih because all of the narrators were sahih. I should spend more time in explaining this, but we don't have the time. But I hope you understand what I'm saying. That the first 3 generations or 4 generations, everybody was completely upright, reliable. But then a 5th narrator, and the time comes of Tirmidhi or Abu Dawud or whatever, that person is weak, although the 4 are at the top. Imam Abu Hanifa has taken it from the 4th one or the 3rd one. Right? So for him it's sahih, but later that hadith becomes weak maybe. Right? That's a possibility as well. So, we mustn't take this in black and white. You must understand that this is a very intricate system. Okay? And, I don't want to go into much more detail here, but you have to remember Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he says himself, and Suyuti relates this from him in Tadrib al-Rawi, right? And his practice shows this as well. He says that when it comes to Aqidah, or when it comes to fiqh, then we really go down on the hadith and scrutinize it. When it comes to fadail, we take a step back. If you look at Imam Bukhari, it's only in his Sahih, right, his Al-Jami' al-Sahih, that he's taken up this criteria to only include what's Sahih according to him. If you look at his Juz' al-Qira'ah khalf al-Imam, Juz' al-Fatiha, and his Al-Adab al-Mufrad, it's full of da'if hadith. Full of them. So if it's okay for him, why isn't it okay for us? What's the point of somebody coming and taking Imam al-Tirmidhi's book and making a Sahih Sunan al-Tirmidhi? And taking out what he thinks is weak and making, this is what I think is the Sahih of At-Tirmidhi or Sahih of Ibn Majah. Right? What's the point of that? If it was good for those Imams, why not for us? Right? So these are just some of the things, but one thing I must tell you and I must encourage is that this is not a point of argument. It's an academic difference. And this is something that they have agreed to disagree on, and it enriches the faith to a certain degree. Right? As long as your issues are not in Aqidah, that's a problem, right? When it comes to fiqh, let them do that, let them do this, right? You've got a lot of ignorance all around the world. If you've got somebody in a typical masjid in India or Pakistan, he says Ameen aloud, I'm telling you, they will turn around and say, Wahhabi, go and kill him or something like that, right? Because they've never just seen it before. But in England and in London, especially where we stay, we've got a number of issues. That's why whenever I spoke in America about any fiqh, I would say, some say this, but this is the one I follow. I even stopped saying this is Hanbali or Shafi'i, because that just confused some people, because people are so far away. They've come from under a system, but they don't really know what system it is. And you don't want them to feel that they've been doing wrong all their life, if they've been following a good system. That's why what I would normally say is that this is one opinion, other ulama have said this, I prefer this one for this reason. So at least they feel that, we're following qualified scholarship, but, I could move over if I want because this seems better, because he's convincing us of, what the reason is. Right? So don't ever argue with others about it. It's a futile argument. We've got a lot of major things to think about and to deal with from outside our faith tradition. That's why you might be thinking, well, why the point of this? The point of this is that we got a problem. Right? We have a problem. And hopefully from more knowledge of really what happened in history and the reason why these things happened, right, will give us more tolerance, will give us a higher standing in terms of an academic nature, so that we can start looking at things more professionally as opposed to more culturally, right, or in a more biased way. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the tawfiq. Let's not go around taking people out of the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, whether it comes from a Hanafi, Shafi or somebody else, it doesn't matter. Let us just focus on the true things that we have, and let us try to at least come together on a brotherly level, inshallah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the tawfiq. Jazakallah khairan a lot for your patience, but I thought that if we left the historical aspect only, it would have not really finished it off properly for us. Thanks a lot, Jazakallah khair for your patience and your sabr. Allah reward you for that. Wa bashiri sabirin. Jazakallah khair. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.